We're moving now away from our Intel processors and into our AMD type processor sockets. We're going to go ahead and start with our Socket 940. As the name gives us a hint, this socket does have 940 pins. However, unlike the Intel sockets that we discussed, this is actually a PGA type socket, standing for pin grid array. Now, a pin grid array is different than a LAN grid array in that on a LAN grid array, the pins that we have that connect our CPU to the board are on the motherboard. On a pin grid array, our pins are actually on the CPU. And then the motherboard itself actually has a zero insertion force type socket that we can place that in. This is a socket, and as you can see, it's a plastic platter with holes on it that allows us to raise a lever here, place our CPU on, and then once we've gently allowed that CPU to make contacts, we lower the lever back in place and it will move our CPU into the correct place and lock it there for us. Now with the AMD 940, in addition to having 940 pins and being a pin grid array socket, the AMD 940 is going to allow us to use processors such as the Athlon 64FX, as well as early Opteron. So, Socket 940 helps us out because it has 940 in the name, so that's easy to remember. It has 940 pins. We want to remember that it's a pin grid array type socket where it receives the pins from the CPU and the different types of processors that it can work with. Moving on to our next type of AMD socket, we actually have the AMD Socket AM2. Now, unfortunately, this one's a little bit more difficult because it doesn't actually give us the number of pins that it has in its name, but it does also have 940 pins, exactly like its predecessor, the Socket 940. Now, the Socket AM2 was released about 2006, and in addition to having 940 pins, the type of processors that we're going to work with range from the 1.6 gigahertz Sempron to more high-end processors such as our 3.0 gigahertz Athlon. So we can see that we do have quite a different range of processor speeds that we have available for this particular socket. But it still is a bit of an early socket and one that is getting older in age and that we've kind of moved on to newer ones. The next step up that we have from the AMD2 socket would be our AM2 Plus socket. Our AM2 Plus socket also has 940 pins. But we have an advantage over our standard AM2 socket because it actually has a faster speed than an AM2 standard socket. And it also supports processors that have an L3 cache. Types of processors which excel in using this socket would include our Phenom X2 as well as our Phenom X4 and Athlon X2. So we have, again, our socket AM2 Plus is going to have the same 940 pins like the standard AM2, but it's going to be faster and we're going to support an L3 cache. Moving on up in our AMD series, we have our Socket AM3. Now this socket is going to be have been released about 2009, about 3 years newer, or 3 years closer to us than the 2006 AM2 release. And the AM3 socket is actually going to have 941 pin locations. And it is going to support processors such as our Phenom 2 X3 as well as X4 and X6 and Athlon 2 X2 as well as our X4 and a few other processors as well. But those are going to be some of the ones that stand out. We also have our Sempron 100 series in there. So again, remember, we've now stepped out of having our 940 pins, which we had in our Socket 940, our AM2, and our AM2 Plus, and we've moved up one pin to 941 pins with our AM3 socket. Now, a bit of a step up from our actual AM3 standard socket, we have our AM3 Plus socket. Our major difference to look at for this socket is going to be that it actually supports up to 8 cores, as well as the fact that it has 942 pins. Remember that our AM3 standard socket has 941 pins, so think our AM3 Plus, just add one more pin and we'll have 942 pins. Now we're in our AMD F-type sockets. We have our Socket FM1, and this socket was released in the year 2011. For this socket, we're actually looking at 905 pins. So less pins than any of the other AMD sockets that we've seen so far. And it is one that we do have to remember just from our knowledge bank, because the actual name of the socket doesn't really give us much help on that. Some of the types of CPUs that we'll see using this socket will be those such as the Athlon 2 X4, X6, as well as our A4-3300 series processors. So just remember that our FM1 sockets, those are going to have been released about 2001 with a 905 pin count, and we're going to be looking at Athlon 2 X4 and X6 type processors, as well as our A4-3300 series processors. So our last socket that we're going to take a look at is going to be our Socket F. The Socket F, which is an AMD socket, has 1,207 pins, and the first time we're going to see this Socket F is going to be about the year 2006. Now, some things to remember about the Socket F socket that we're going to find on the motherboard is that this is the one AMD socket that we need to know is actually a land grid array type socket. It's not going to be a pin grid array like the rest of their sockets which we talked about, where the pin grid array pins are on the CPU itself. For this socket, the pins are going to be on the motherboard, again, because it's a land grid array, which means we actually have the pins on the socket rather than the pins being on the CPU and placing the CPU into the socket. The Socket F, we're going to see that mostly on AMD server line type motherboards. So when we think of Socket F, normally we won't see these on just a standard desktop computer type motherboard, but again, this will be more toward server lines. Now, the type of processors that are going to work with or that are going to use our Socket F are going to be those like our Athlon 64 and our Athlon 64 X2. Just remember, Socket F are about the year 2006, 1,207 pins, and it's going to be a land grid array, and it's going to be on our server line.